We are live. 7 seconds in. I'm always on a delay when I check. Hi, welcome to Founder of the Day. We are going to be discussing... Start. I do want to make a few announcements. First of all, I am going to recommend a book today that I think everyone who likes reading my website and learning through these videos would enjoy. We'll get to that in a little bit. Just to review, we're going to go through the last 7 articles I published for Founder of the Day. I'm going to talk about some of the things I learned, and hopefully you can learn along with me. No hat this week. It's getting warmer, so I don't need the hat. Let's see. People rolling in. Thanks for joining us, everyone. If you want to hit like, I would really appreciate it. That helps out the channel a lot. It helps people find out about us, and YouTube likes us more, so it tells more people in their scrolls. All right. I do want to say, so I've been doing these live videos on Saturday afternoons. It just seemed natural at first when I did it, but I've realized that Saturday afternoons is the worst time to do something like this because, well, a lot of people are busy, especially this time of year where it's getting nice out. People are going to go out on the weekends, and, well, it limits not only the amount of people watching, but people's ability to watch. So I put some feelers out on the interweb and gotten some responses back, and it seems like the overwhelming response is that Wednesdays would be best. So I'm going to move these videos, and I apologize to anyone who watches, those of you who have been watching for any amount of time, or even if this is your first time, you know, if Wednesdays are tough for you, I really apologize, but I want to make it as accessible as I can to people. If it is a lot of trouble, leave me a comment. Of course, you can always watch the live videos in hindsight when they're done, but at this point, you know, I got to try and give it to as many people as I can. So we're going to do it Wednesdays at 7 from here on out. Hi, TJ, you made it. Well, I'm glad. I hope you heard my announcement. I am going to move the live videos to Wednesdays at 7 o'clock. I hope that's okay. Especially for, you know, people like you who have been here since the beginning, TJ. I really appreciate your watching and your efforts to come join. Hopefully, because Saturdays are busy, Wednesdays at 7 will be more accessible to most people. I really hope so. And they're about an hour, so 7 to like 7:45, 8 o'clock. I feel like that's an amount of time. As kids that go but we right. So let's start talking about the American Revolution. Last week I published, as always on Saturdays and Sundays, I publish older articles just to keep them coming back. I've published about 700 in just over 2 years. So I don't want them to go to waste. I started taking the weekends off from writing and publishing new ones. Instead of 7 days a week, I just do 5 days a week. Many of you will know. So I'm starting to reuse them because a lot of the founders I've done are super interesting and I don't want to say goodbye to them. And so on Saturday, I published about Benjamin Harrison. Now, if you recognize the name Benjamin Harrison, you'll probably think about the President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison, but this is not who we're talking about. Today we're talking about Declaration of Independence signer Benjamin Harrison, whose son, William Henry Harrison, was President of the United States, and whose great-grandson, great-grandson, let me say that again. Benjamin Harris's son, William Henry, was president, and Benjamin Harris's great-grandson, also Benjamin Harrison, was also President of the United States. So that's pretty much what the Harrison family is most famous for. Let me just check this. Sorry to interrupt. I got a weird warning here. No, we're still good. Okay. Oh. Please comment. Up, and I want to make sure everything looks good. Anyway, until then, I'll assume everything's good, or totally bad and I'm talking to myself. Let's continue. So Benjamin Harrison, the signer of the Declaration, who's, again, his family's most famous for having 2 presidents in it, but Harrison himself was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. But more important than that, he went to the First Continental Congress and signed the Articles of Association, and while he was at the Second Continental Congress, he was chairman of what was called the Committee of the Whole. And you might have heard me speak about the Committee of the Whole several times in the past. The Committee of the Whole was a parliamentary procedure that basically it gave people the opportunity to speak freely. There was a president of Congress, and what they would do is they would have the president step down and the chairman of the Committee of Whole take over. It was a committee that included every single person in the Congress. And this would keep happening. They would later use this in the Constitutional Convention, and theoretically they can use it today. I'm not sure if they still use it today or not, but basically you could debate openly, and if you said something that was wrong or voted down, you didn't have to be embarrassed by it, because it wasn't an official vote. It was just discussion in the committee, even though this committee was everyone in Congress. So what they did is they would go and have votes, and Benjamin Harrison in the Second Continental Congress was appointed as chairman of the Committee of the Whole. And while he was chairman, he received... I'm sorry, I'm going to pause for a second here. I know this is a live stream, and this is not how you want to have live streams. But TJ... it sounds good to me. Oh, no, but you were talking about earlier. I'm sorry, everyone. Let me see. Suggestion. Stream is healthy. Warning. Stream setting. I don't know how to fix it. If no one's commented, well, 3 of you are still watching. Someone left. I apologize. If there's any trouble seeing it, it looks good to me on here. Stream health. Stream health is good. Well, I'll be honest. I'm not great at using the internet. It's fine. Thank you, Matthew. I apologize for the delay. Thank you for letting me know. I will continue, assuming everything was fine. I really appreciate that. I'm not an internet whiz. I read history books. Sorry, guys. Anyway, Benjamin Harrison was appointed as chairman of the Committee of the Whole. So what would happen is, when they were getting ready for the Declaration of Independence to be read and signed, John Hancock would step down from the chair, and Benjamin Harrison would take over. And Benjamin Harrison is the one who actually oversaw the discussions regarding the Declaration of Independence. Oh, Ned. Now, welcome, Ned. What do you say? What were you saying about Benjamin Harrison? Benjamin Harrison has a bridge over the James River. Virginia, named for him. I drive across from time to time. Benjamin Harrison has a bridge. Doesn't surprise me. A lot of signers of many of the documents have many things named after them. Thank you for your input. So, as for Harrison, he actually was the person sitting in chair as committee chairman while the entire Continental Congress debated declaring independence. And so, therefore, he was actually the one to do the final reading of the Declaration of Independence after they had amended it and removed about a quarter of it because of certain language that Jefferson was being a little too revolutionary about. So, Benjamin Harrison actually oversaw the debate on independence. And then he stepped down, and John Hancock stepped back up, and they voted for independence. They voted to ratify the Declaration of Independence. He would, like I said, go on to sign the document. He was a really interesting character. Actually, when they signed the document, there's a famous moment where, I'm going to paraphrase this. It's a long quote. I'm not going to quote him. I'm going to paraphrase. But essentially, Benjamin Harrison was a pretty big dude, and Elbridge Gerry was a fairly slight person. And when they signed the Declaration of Independence, it was a very somber moment. I mean, a lot of these guys were sad they were leaving Britain. You know, they loved being British. It was very sad that it came to this, and many of them didn't want it. And even if they did want it, you know, they were basically signing a death warrant saying, "Hey, Mr. King, please come kill us. We're committing treason." So, it was a quiet, and the room was melancholy. And, well, Benjamin Harrison was known for his sense of humor, so he turned to Mr. Gerry and said, "Hey, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially, hey, when they hang us, I have an advantage over you. I'm nice and big, so I'm going to die right away. You're going to dance around for a while." And it got a little bit of a laugh out of the Continental Congress, again, during a really somber moment when they were literally declaring independence. I mean, technically this was in August. They didn't sign the document until about a month after independence was declared, but the point is the same. Harrison would go on to, he would actually be governor of Virginia just 2 months after the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia. Harrison was elected as governor, and he spent the next 3 years as governor during the initial phases of building an independent nation, now that independence had officially been won. He also had a noteworthy. He had a lot of disagreements with John Adams, actually, which was surprising. They had a really interesting correspondence. He also went to the Virginia Ratification Convention that voted on whether or not to accept the Constitution, and he voted against ratification. It was a close vote. I think there was like 180 voters, and Virginia only accepted it by 5 votes. I believe it was a single-digit margin, and Harrison actively opposed the Constitution, but he gets a lot of credit because after the Constitution was accepted, there were people out there saying, we're not going to do this. We're not going to listen. Who cares? And Harrison came out and said, no, listen, like, we lost the vote, and this is what the majority of people wanted. So even though I'm not happy about it, I'm going to follow the rules, and you should too. And we should now take steps to add a Bill of Rights to amend the Constitution to what we really think it should be. So he was noteworthy for that aspect. So that's briefly Benjamin Harrison, who's a really fun life. I also forgot to mention earlier on, he was with Thomas Lynch and Benjamin Franklin when they went to Boston to review Washington's army. A lot of interesting facts with him. Let's see, any questions? You guys chit-chatting? Good. I'm glad you guys are having fun. After this, on Sunday, I republished an article about Dr. Benjamin Rush. Dr. Benjamin Rush. He is another Declaration of Independence signer. Fascinating guy. He was an early physician in the United States, although he went to Edinburgh in Great Britain to get his PhD, medical degree. I found it, medical degree. And he came back and he helped with the American Revolution. He became a surgeon, I think he was Surgeon General for the Middle Department. So he oversaw the medical goings on of the Continental Army for the Mid-Atlantic states. Although he resigned that eventually, he became part of what I like to call the hospital department rivalry, which featured Dr. William Shippen and Dr. Morgan, who used to be friends and then were enemies and then really went at each other, and he took Morgan's side in that rivalry. But he would go on to be a founder of Dickinson College. He would he worked in the U.S. Treasury. He was a supporter of the Constitution. He ratified it at that convention. He had a lot to do with the founding, but what he's most known for is actually what he did for health in the early founding. First of all, he was a little restrained in some of his decisions. He was against, it was called heroic medicine, but it wasn't very heroic. Basically, he promoted bloodletting. Now, I know it's easy for us to look back and say, oh, bloodletting, ugh. Bloodletting's gross. That was obviously a bad decision. But at the same time, we can, it's common to look back in history and say that's all they knew back then. The thing is, when Dr. Rush was still doing bloodletting, when most other doctors, even in America, were saying, that's archaic, like, we shouldn't be draining people's blood anymore, he was one of the last holdouts still draining blood. He even drained blood for George Washington on a few occasions, and other people were like, Washington, like, what are you doing? Like, we don't do this anymore. It's just draining your blood. It's not helping you at all. But, old habits die hard. And it's a little bit surprising that Washington would go through that, because Washington was also an early acceptor of vaccines. He had many Continental soldiers vaccinated, but he was still doing bloodletting. It's a strange contradiction. But before we get too down on Dr. Rush, he became one of the first people concerned with mental health in the United States. And he's actually today considered the founder of modern psychiatry, which, some people don't love psychiatry, and that's fine. But many people do, and many people use psychiatrists. And he is one of the most important, if not the most important, founders of modern psychiatry. In fact, the National Psychiatry, I think it's called the American Psychiatry Association, the APA, I believe is what it's called, but the big American psychiatry organization, their logo has a picture of Dr. Benjamin Rush on it, because he was the first one to come out and say, like, this might not be, a disease, like, this might be mental health, like, we might be able to, cure it with the mind. And he also discussed things like, addiction. Is addiction, like, is that a mental health problem? He didn't have all the answers for these things, and many of the decisions he made were wrong. But that leads on to his place in prisons. He was very much against capital punishment, and he also was, I see a question, I'll get right back to it. He was against capital punishment. He was one of the first people against capital punishment, and he started prisons that he hoped could reform people. It used to be like, a criminal go to jail, they're never going to be fixed. Put them in jail. He said, no, there are things we can do to fix these people. Now, I will say, many of the things he decided to do, again, were not helpful and very much the opposite of what he was going for. But, unfortunately, when you're learning new things, you got to make mistakes along the way. Double unfortunately, these mistakes were, not humorously, people who were treated very poorly. But the Walnut Street prison he built in Philadelphia was really the first step towards modern prisons, which are supposed to be reform penitentiaries and supposed to help people. Now, I'm not going to get into how prisons work today and why we have so many people in jail in America, but still, the point is there. And I do also have to note that Dr. Benjamin Rush was an early and active abolitionist. Before abolition was a term in the United States, when it was still called manumission, when, the idea was we need to get people to free their own slaves. He did promote the government. He was active when Pennsylvania, in 1780, before the war was even over, got rid of slavery. To be fair, he made claims that were super racist. While he was trying to free black people, he also thought that black people's skin was a different color because of a disease that could be cured, and they could be white again. Clearly not a good decision. Clearly not acceptable, but again, like most of the things Rush did in his life, he was trying to help people. He was trying to use science and the Enlightenment to better the world, at least in the view he thought. I don't think that's a better world where we're all white. That's not what I'm trying to say. But that, again, he was trying to solve what he saw as problems, and slavery was a problem. And I mean, I'm not going to get too into whether or not making black people white would have solved the problem. Clearly it's racist, clearly it's a bad idea, but he was trying. I did see a question come in about Dr. Rush, I believe. Let's see, psychiatry. I imagine there was some PSD. Among members of the Continental Army, how were they treated, if at all? So, PTSD was first diagnosed, to my understanding, really as shell shock in World War I. Because World War I was such, and I'm getting a little off the American Revolution here, we're going to jump ahead 100 years. World War I was such an unbelievable experience for people. They were fighting an old-style war with new weapons. So people would just go out there and stand in line and get machine gunned down. Or they fortify, and this happened in Belgium, when Germany first started attacking, they would get fortified in a fort that 15 years earlier you could stay in this fort. An enemy army could lay siege to it, and you could stay in this fort for months, and you'd be fine. And just keep them out until they starved you out, as for thousands of years wars were fought. But this time they went in the fort and would just explode from miles away, and just the whole idea of, like, people couldn't believe what they were seeing. And generals and officers would say, "What are you doing? Get in a war. Go back and fight." And, like, people, like, physically couldn't. They were, like, freaked out. As PTSD, we know now, can really mess with you. But the first time I understand that it was actually diagnosed as a problem was in World War II as shell shock. Now, that being said, you see some gruesome stuff in any war. And, in the Revolutionary War, at certain times, it came to, like, bayonet fights. And you would have seen gruesome stuff. You could have been wounded and have your leg ripped off by a cannon. So, I am certain people suffered from it. But, I have never specifically investigated it. I'm gonna make a note. If my pen works. PTSD. I'm going to look into that for you, Ned, because that's a really great question. From what I've seen, I've never seen it diagnosed or specifically discussed. I'm sure there are discussions of it, although I believe it would have either been framed in the aspects of like morale. You know, well, this guy, his morale is down since he had his arm blown off by a cannon. You know, or you know, or it would have been not mental health, but they would have said there's something, you know. I can't think of the adjective they would have used to describe him off the top of my head, but similar to James Otis had lost his mind. Well, James Otis was a very early leader in Boston, leading to the Revolution, and then didn't really participate too much in the Revolution. He started because he got hit in the head, and that seems to have helped him lose his mind. But they referred to that as his capacities or his facilities were not what they used to be. So that's generally how they would refer to it. Again, from my understanding, that's the closest thing off the top of my head I can think of is the James Otis getting hit in the head. He seemed to already be a little losing it, and then he got hit in the head and really lost it. And I don't mean to degrade anyone and say lost it. I'm not trying to speak poorly about mental health. I understand it's a real issue. It's hard to communicate how people thought 250 years ago about mental health without sounding like an ignorant fool on YouTube right now today. But yeah, they would have just simply said his facilities aren't there, or his constitution is lagging, but they wouldn't have necessarily equated it with the war. Let's see. Oh, you guys have a lot coming out. Great. This is fun. Oops. Let's see. How would they treated it? Probably opium. Yeah. Yeah, no problem. Probably opium. Opium. That's a good question. I know that opium had made it to the United States. I would not have been highly in use. They probably would not have treated it at all. Again, so by the time Dr. Rush is really starting psychiatry and starting his prison reform and everything, it's already basically the Jefferson administration. Once he starts going public with this and really trying to do something publicly about it, he had studied it for a long time, but before he wanted to do research before he actually brought it to the public. So, this would have been after, yeah. So during the Revolution, they wouldn't have actually treated it. I really don't think it. Did Indians smoke in the peace pipe? No, because opium would have come from China and Asia in the East. That's why it wasn't, from my understanding, a lot of it around. I don't know what was in the peace pipe. I believe peace pipes changed based on Native American tribes. I think most of it was tobacco. For most of the Native Americans, again, it's hard to... There's so much variety, believe it or not, there's so much variety between Native American tribes that to say this is what they did, it's like the video I made last week about the Founding Fathers. It's hard to say what the Native Americans did. It's even harder to say what the Native Americans did because there's such a wide variety. Yes, tobacco. Tobacco was something the Native Americans showed to the colonists pretty much right when they got here. It's not like the colonists showed up and said, "Oh, what's this plant? Let's smoke it." They showed up and said, "Hey, what are they smoking?" "Oh, this is great. This is wonderful. Let's transport this around the world." And again, that's not all the tribes. Like, I think the ones in... And I am by no means very well versed in Native American tribes. I'm actually a little embarrassed by it. I want to write more about Native Americans. It's something I have been trying to read about recently. But again, I'm learning as I go for a lot of these founders. That's why I started this, is to learn and share what I learn. Yeah, I would have to do more research before I could really answer that, but Virginia tobacco is good. I'm a former smoker, so... And a lot of tobacco is good. No comment. Don't smoke, kids. It's really bad for you and super hard to quit. Anyway, I'm really glad we got off topic like this. I have a lot of fun. This is why I want to do this. I hope you guys can join us on Wednesdays. I don't know if you missed it, Ned, or who came in late. I do want to repeat that I am going to move these live videos to Wednesdays at 7. I put a bunch of feelers out there online and such, and Wednesday seems to be the day that's best for everyone. So I just, I apologize if you can't make it. For the few of you who have been coming on Saturdays, I really appreciate it. And I really hope you can join us on Wednesdays instead. It's just more people can come on Wednesdays. Saturday afternoons, like, we're busy. It's 3 o'clock. It's a nice day. I understand you don't necessarily want to be hanging out watching me on YouTube. I get it. I think I saw some questions come in. Yeah, don't smoke. Problem with smoking is no, I'm not even going to say it out loud. We found an old China camp with opium bottles in Nevada. That's super cool. No more Swisher sheets. No. No, I was talking about... No. Not anymore. I'm an old man now. That's super cool. You found... Yeah, see, that's the problem, is I don't know a ton about Native Americans, especially, like, in the Southwest. I think of the Navajo and all that. Again, I don't know really much of anything about them. I'm kind of ashamed, but I can't learn about every culture in the whole world. I try so hard. Wednesday's opium night? Okay. Opium night with founder of the day. Oh man, hopefully YouTube doesn't get me in trouble for just saying that. Let's see. Okay, let's continue. I don't want to keep you guys here all day, but this is a lot of fun. So, speaking of fun, last Monday, I did an article that is fun. I do these every once in a while, and I just wrote about the top 9 American revolutionaries named Thomas. Seems random. It is random. I did one about George a while back. I just wanted to try another one. I have fun with it. Got to take a day off and have some fun every once in a while. So, just a note, it's only Thomas. People with the first name Thomas. People with the last name Thomas don't fit in. Sorry, John Thomas. You're not included. I guess I'll just run through them real quick. The briefest stories. Thomas Stone, signer of the Declaration of Independence and Articles of Confederation. Twofer, Thomas Lynch Sr. and Thomas Lynch Jr. Thomas Lynch Sr. was in the First Continental Congress. And then while he was in the second, they were from South Carolina, but while he was in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress, he had a stroke. And his son, also Thomas Lynch Jr., was sent from South Carolina to take care of him and take his spot in the Second Continental Congress. So, while he's at the second, basically, Thomas Lynch Sr. signed the Articles of Association. Thomas Lynch Jr. signed the Declaration of Independence. Both Thomas Lynches were in Philadelphia when the Declaration was signed, but Sr. was just too sick from his stroke to make the trip a few blocks over and sign it, or they would have been the only father-son tandem to sign the Declaration of Independence. Though, to be fair, if he could make the trip to sign it, then Jr. probably would have been set up to replace him. There would have been no need for that. And it is a sad story, because shortly after that, Sr. dies. Lynch is bringing him home. They stop in Baltimore, and he dies there. And then Jr. gets sick, and he ends up just a few years later getting on a boat to go to the Caribbean, because that was a common recommendation by doctors for certain diseases was to get better air. And he died on the boat ride. So, super bummer. Sorry about that. Anyway, Thomas number 7 is Thomas Conway. He was famous for the Conway Cabal. He is the one who got caught discussing maybe replacing George Washington with Horatio Gates, and that didn't end well. John Caldwater shot him in the mouth. You might remember a video I made about that. Number 6, Thomas Fitzsimmons. Important leader in Philadelphia, and the only Catholic to sign the United States Constitution, making him the minority, essentially. I know today we don't necessarily view Catholics as minorities like maybe we have in the past, and during the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the fact that there was a Constitution, the fact that there was a Catholic even at the Constitutional Convention was bold. It was new. Things were changing. Thomas number 5, Thomas Johnson. very not well known at all. First Continental Congress delegate who signed the Articles of Association and would later go on. He was important throughout the Revolution and was named by Washington as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He wasn't one of the inaugural members. I think it was 1791, so 2 years in. He was one of the earliest Supreme Court justices, and he served the shortest amount of time in Supreme Court history, 163 days. And he was like, I don't feel very well. I'm done. Now, to be fair, the first handful of years, the Supreme Court really didn't accomplish much. Anyway, Thomas number 4, Thomas Pinckney. Thomas Pinckney, really important founder. Worked for Horatio Gates as an aide-de-camp during the Revolution. Was a governor of Virginia, and during his time as governor was the ratification convention in Virginia, and he oversaw that. And again, Virginia was the biggest and most important state in the Union. And as I said before, it only passed by 5 votes in Virginia, so it was really good he was there. And then, kind of most importantly, when John Adams ran for his second term, he wasn't really running with Thomas Jefferson anymore, and even though tickets wouldn't be established until the 12th Amendment was passed a few years later, essentially this was the first time that a president and vice president ran for both parties, Jefferson and Aaron Burr famously, against incoming President John Adams and Thomas Pinckney, who was the first person to ever really run for vice president of the United States. He and Burr were the first 2 people to simultaneously run, I should say, and Burr won that and almost tricked people into making him president instead of Thomas Jefferson. Number 3, Thomas Mifflin. Thomas Mifflin is really surprising that he's not more well known. He was one of the first aide-de-camps to General Washington. He was quartermaster general for a good portion of the war. He was president of the Continental Congress when the Revolutionary War ended. In fact, he's the one who signed the final approval of the Treaty of Paris, and he's the one when George Washington was done generaling and the war was over in 1783. When Washington went home, he stopped in, they weren't in Philadelphia, I think they were meeting in like maybe Baltimore, somewhere, wherever. Washington stopped on his way home at the Continental Congress to resign his commission, to literally take the piece of paper they gave him 8 years beforehand and hand it back. The man he handed it to was president of the Continental Congress, Thomas Mifflin. Mifflin accepted George Washington's resignation. He also signed the United States Constitution because he was part of the Constitutional Convention, and he became governor of Pennsylvania. And maybe most importantly, if you've ever seen the show The Office, you might recognize that they work at a company in Pennsylvania called Dunder Mifflin. And yes, Dunder Mifflin is named after, it's an homage to Thomas Mifflin, who is a favorite son of Pennsylvania. From there, number 2 shouldn't be too surprising. Thomas Paine. He is one of the few people credited as the penman of the Revolution. These are the times that try men's souls. He wrote in his first article of The Crisis, which was a reoccurring series during the Revolution to inspire soldiers, which it did inspire rank-and-file soldiers, as well as Common Sense. How did I forget that? Common Sense, which was published in January of 1776, just a few months before independence was declared, and it basically said, the time has come. Famously, how can an island rule a continent? As well as many other arguments. He was basically reiterating comments already being made, people already discussing independence. He took it all, put it in layman's terms, and published it. And it was a wild success. He sold 300,000 copies in just a few months. And this is a period in time where, like, today, if I sold 300,000 copies of a book, I'd be super happy. But we have 350 million people in America, and it's a lot easier to sell 350,000 copies to 350 million people than it is to sell 300,000 copies to, what was it at the time? 20, 30 million tops? I don't know. I should know the population in hindsight. We'll look that up for next week. So a wild success. Just, and he would have a super interesting life. I got to do a whole video on him, because then he went to France and started the French Revolution. He tried to go to Britain and started a British Revolution. That one didn't work out. I mean, he helped write the French Constitution when they first had their independence, and he wrote, oops, I'm driving a motorcycle. He wrote Rights of Man there, just really important. Thomas Paine is fascinating. I highly recommend you guys, if you don't know a lot about him, look him up. He was crazy, because he came back to America basically broke. He went to jail for a while, came back, he was buried kind of in an unmarked grave with 8 people at his funeral, because he had talked a lot of trash about George Washington and basically everyone. I mean, he wanted to do all sorts of things. He proposed, if you came across Andrew Yang with his universal basic income running the recent presidential campaign, you might have heard him reference Thomas Paine, because Thomas Paine is one of the earliest people to actually say in his book Agrarian Justice that, you know, we should split money like this. I don't want, we shouldn't get too off topic, but fascinating person. In fact, 100 years after he died, there was a British person who said, you know what, he deserves more honor. We should bring him back to Britain where he was born and bury him in his hometown where he was first born, because he was so important to the world. He shouldn't be born randomly in upstate New York. He should be buried where he was born. So they got his bones, dug up his bones, put him on a ship, went back to Europe, and lost the bones. Yeah, Thomas Paine's bones are gone. They were brought back, put in storage until the guy who got them could save up more money, spend all this money shipping the bones, and then needed more money to bury him, and never got the money, and his bones disappeared. There's a band called Pinata Land. Go on Spotify and look up Pinata Land. They have a lot of cool songs about random history people, and there's one called American Man, about the guy digging up Thomas Paine's bones and sending them across the ocean. There's a bunch of cool songs. They're really cool. If you like American history, definitely check out Pinata Land. One word, weird name. I don't know why they named it, but cool band. And number 1 Thomas of the American Revolution, no surprise here. I'm not that crafty. Thomas Jefferson. Come on. I'm not even going to elaborate. If you don't know who Thomas Jefferson is, I got a lot of work cut out for me. Okay, I saw you guys making some comments. Let's see. Oh, ton of comments. Oh, TJ, yeah, that's so sweet of you. I'm glad you've learned with me. I knew making these the videos and writing the articles, I came into it with about 15 years of just study on my own. I'm a grad school dropout. That's anything. I'd studied history in grad school, but realized it was time to get to work and start a life. But I kept reading in my own time, so I have a background. But the articles I write, videos I make are always based off articles I've already written, just to make sure I know about the person. I can reread my article, get it fresh in my head before I make the video, because you can tell I do it in one shot. I just reread, make sure I got not screwing anything up, maybe do a little ancillary research. But the articles I write are almost always something new I learned. Even if it's a person I know about, I try and learn something new about them. So I'm hoping you guys come along and learn with me. So I'm glad. I appreciate you saying that. I really do. I hope you can come to Wednesdays, and at least you keep watching the videos. Mifflin has a building named after him at Fort Lee. Fort Lee is where the quartermasters are in the Army. Oh, I didn't know that. Interesting. So he's got I guess a quartermaster building named after him. Probably the most, I would think the most, I'm surprised, the most famous quartermaster of the Continental Army would probably be Nathaniel Greene, who did it for a while, and then actually, Greene became probably the most important general after George Washington to the Continental Army. He essentially oversaw the victory in the South, which was not looking good when he took over. But he remained quartermaster general, and he told Washington, he would only remain quartermaster general if he could also fight in the field, because quartermasters didn't fight in the field, they were just generals. So let's see, Margaret Brownstone, I saw another comment. Yes, just some trivia. Yeah, yeah. And I was thinking about making like a weekly trivia game. If that's interesting to you guys, let me know, because I wouldn't know exactly how to go about it, but I've been recommended by my dad for a long time to do a weekly game. Oh, Mifflin Hall. Yeah, that makes sense. Very cool. Just give me 1 second. How long have I been talking? 40 minutes. Yeah, I've been talking a lot. We've got a little ways to go. Before we go, didn't some weird stuff happen to the bones of Anthony Wayne? Oh, Matt, that sounds so familiar. That sounds so familiar. I'm gonna I know when Wayne died, I believe it was Wayne, when he died, he had like a tree fall on his tent and hit his head, but he was like seemingly okay. No. I'm going to write that down if my pen will work. Let's find a pen that works. I try to be prepared. PTSD. Wayne's bones. I'm going to browse through here real quick. Let's see. Timber. Yeah, tree fell on his head. I'm looking at my article. He was knocked unconscious but survived. He returned. He died from complications of gout, which may have elevated into dropsy. I don't have it here. I'll tell you what, Matt. I'm gonna look up to that when we do our new video on Wednesday. Hopefully you can join us, and I will definitely have an answer for you there, because it does sound very familiar. People were relocated kind of often then, especially Wayne spent a lot of time out. No, he died from complications of gout. He was in Pennsylvania, so he probably would have been buried there. Man, that sounds familiar. Sorry, I cannot remember everything about every founder. I have written about 700 different people in the last 2 years. But Wayne's super famous. I know most of his story, and like I said, that sounds extraordinarily familiar. I'm surprised I'm not remembering it off the top of my head, and I apologize. But I will look that up for you. And I'll send you a message on YouTube. Can I do that? Maybe. I'll leave a comment. I'll find a way to let you know. I promise. I'm not sure how. Not perfect at YouTube yet, clearly. But I will find out. But unless there's another question or comment along the way, because I apologize for not knowing. But Margaret Brown Stone. Her name was Margaret Brown. She married Thomas Stone, who I mentioned just before as one of the Thomases. Her husband was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Her name was Margaret Brown, married Thomas Stone, and I found this clever. Her name was Margaret Brown Stone. And I was going to make the title something about a brownstone, like a building, but they didn't live in one, and that's is really a stretch. I was trying to come up with a title, and it was just all a stretch and garbage, and like, I got to make my titles a little bit clickbaity, but, well, I don't want them to be lies. Facebook, yeah, I can put it out on Facebook. I will. I don't know, Matt, let me know if you follow me on like Twitter or Facebook, whichever one. I'll put out a comment. I keep trying to do Instagram better, but I don't know why. Like, I gotta go out of my way to find like a computer and take a picture. I don't live close enough to much stuff to take pictures of. Most of what I talk about has been dead for a long time. I live in the area that the Sullivan-Clinton campaign came through and burned a bunch of Native American villages, and now those areas trees have grown. So I can basically go around and take pictures and say, here, see these trees? This was once Native American village that got burned, and now a tree grew. It'll be cool the first time, but after weeks and weeks, not so much. But yeah, I'll put it out there. Sure. Anyway, so Margaret Brownstone, she's got a sad story. She married Thomas Stone. They had some kids, built a nice house. She had a very large inheritance. Her father was one of the wealthiest men in Maryland. And they had a very large inheritance, had a nice estate. They had a bunch of kids. And then, unfortunately, Thomas's parents died. And he had a lot of younger siblings who all came to live in their house. So they had to keep expanding on this house. A lot of kids at a very young age. In her early 20s, had like 6 or 7 kids running around her house. Her husband would go and sign the Declaration of Independence. Now, I don't like tying women to their husbands. It's something I try desperately to avoid. Margaret's story is inevitably is tied to her husband because when he was in Philadelphia, she went to visit. And yellow fever was common, and she was given a vaccination. Now, I don't want to hear anything about anti-vaccinations in the comments. That's not what we're talking about here, because the vaccinations today are very different back then. At least today they're regulated, and back then they were not. And it was people kind of on their own making it up as they went. And the doctor she went to, for some reason, decided to give her some mercury, to ingest mercury, like a lot of it, while she was, to help get the vaccination. It was an experimental period, and people were doing vaccinations different to try and figure out the best way to do them. Unfortunately, this doctor decided to have her eat a bunch of mercury, and she got mercury poisoning, like hard, and her health declined fast. I should say it quickly declined a little bit and then steadily declined over the next decade, to the point where Thomas Stone would leave the Continental Congress and only work locally with he refused to go back. He was sent back in 1784 briefly, because, Maryland's not that far from Philadelphia, but he really, really didn't want to didn't want to leave Maryland. And they stayed around, and he watched her slowly decline when she died in her mid-30s in 1787, right as the country was getting going. And actually, Thomas only lived a few months longer and passed away, and at 43 years old. So people like to say the anecdote goes that he died of a broken heart. Is that true? Maybe, but we don't have anything else to tell us how he died. And that's what all the stories say, is it was a broken heart. Seems a little romantic, but, stress can kill a person. And I have to assume that's it. So that's the terribly sad story of Margaret Stone Brown. Let's move on to something a little more interesting, although I did see some comments coming through. Let's see. Mercury poisoning seems like a nasty way to die. Yeah. Yes, it does. Doesn't sound fun. I'll put my mercury... I get my salads with mercury on the side. Thank you. Anyway. Let's move on to Samuel Rhodes. Samuel Rhodes was a very interesting person. He was much older than most of the revolutionaries, a little bit younger than Benjamin Franklin, and he and Franklin became friends not long after. Franklin, as a boy, ran away from Boston, ended up in Philadelphia, went to London, and came back still barely 21. And it was at this point, close to this point, he became friendly with Samuel Rhodes, and Samuel and Benjamin started a lot of things together. Benjamin Franklin gets a ton of credit, rightfully gets a ton of credit for starting just boatloads worth of different organizations in Philadelphia and the United States. But he really didn't do many of them alone. He would assemble a group of people and start a business, and assemble a group of people and start a hospital, and assemble a group of people and start a blah, blah, blah. And Samuel Rhodes was one of the people he would regularly go to help assemble these things. For example, the Library Company of Philadelphia, which was one of the first subscription libraries in the United States, and the Philadelphia Contribution Ship. I can't say it. Contribution Ship. Everything I publish with told me it was a misspelling, but no, they just spelled things were weird back then and had strange words. The Contribution Ship was essentially an insurance company. It was a fire insurance company. And you paid in. It was the first modern fire insurance company in the United States. You pay in monthly or annually, and everyone pays into this pool, and if someone has a fire, the pool pays out for it. It's a very quick explanation, but he was... and so Samuel Rhodes was the director of this company for a long time. Additionally, he was an architect. He's also credited as a carpenter, but the differences are minimal. I also saw him referred to as a mechanic, specifically by Franklin at one point. But even though he was an architect, he was one of the first people to oversee the Pennsylvania Hospital, which again was one of Franklin's ideas, one of the first modern hospitals in the United States. And he oversaw this. He was director of this hospital for 3 decades, from 1751 until 1781, through the end of the Revolutionary War. What's really interesting about Rhodes is he was elected to the First Continental Congress, and he signed the Articles of Association, the Continental Association as it's usually called. While he's at the First Continental Congress, now I'll remind you, the First Continental Congress was about 7 weeks long. The Second Continental Congress, that started 6 months later, was 15 years long, but the First Continental Congress was 7 weeks long. Samuel Rhodes went to this, and he was from Philadelphia, and it was in Philadelphia. And while he was there, halfway through serving in the First Continental Congress, he was also elected mayor of Philadelphia. Pretty good for an architect who was directing the hospital, running the library, and overseeing an insurance company. Now, he didn't participate in the greater scale of the war. He never fought. Again, at this point, he's probably too old. He was born, I believe, in 1911, so he's, approaching his mid to late 60s at this point. He's a little bit older to be fighting in the war, especially for a wealthy person. But just a really important, really important to Philadelphia. And as the largest city in the colony, if you were important to Philadelphia during the Revolution, you were important to the United States. He would, like I said, he spent a year as Philadelphia's mayor. He didn't play a gigantic role in the Revolution from there on out, but he continued running the hospital, and he would actually be, what was it called? The Carpenters Association. I believe I took it out when I wrote the article. The Carpenters Company was the head of more or less the construction union in Philadelphia at the time, but it was everyone. It wasn't a union because, I mean, the highest ranking carpenter in the city was the head of it, but you understand the point. Anyway, let's see. Anything else going on? No? Alright, let's move right along, because where are we? We're at 51 minutes. Okay, we're approaching an hour, just like normal. Okay. Thursday I wrote about Joseph Martin. Joseph Martin Jr., I should say, his story is extremely long. As is all of these stories. He was very much a leader in the West, east of the Mississippi, west of the Appalachian Mountains. He was one of the first people to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, when Daniel Boone first went through the Cumberland Gap to settle with Richard Henderson, they were surprised how far out Joseph Martin had established a community in what was then Kentucky. I named the article Joseph Martin Stations because he built a place called Martin Station, which was supposed to be like a waypoint for travelers out west. He built one, and the Native Americans burned it to the ground. And he built another one, and then the Native Americans burned it to the ground. And then he built another one, which was closer to Wilderness Road. That now that Daniel Boone had cut Wilderness Road through the Cumberland Gap and people were traveling, he moved it there, and that one lasted for a good amount of time. Eventually was destroyed. I was contacted by Garrett Jackson, who has written an article for me in the past, and he let me know that they did rebuild one, which I did know. I didn't include it in the article, but I do want to comment that they did build another one and about 15-20 years ago, and if you want to go visit, you can. Now, I mean, right now, I don't know what's open in Kentucky, but pending quarantine, you could definitely go visit. I would call ahead first to make sure they're open. But he's most known for being an Indian agent, as they were called then. He worked for Virginia first, and while he worked for Virginia for 15 years, and about halfway through, he was also hired by North Carolina to do the same job for both at the same time. And he worked mostly with the Cherokee, playing a gigantic role in keeping the Native Americans in the Southwest neutral in the American Revolutionary War. Because most Native Americans wanted to side with the British. They were more worried about colonists infringing on their rights than the British, who had made this proclamation line. You have to remember, one of the reasons that the revolutionaries went to war wasn't just taxes, especially in the South. After we fought the French and Indian War for this land on the West that founders were buying and wanted to settle and sell. Well, we won the Revolutionary War, and then the king made a proclamation line and said, don't cross the Appalachian Mountains, that's Native American territory. So Native Americans were like, sweet, thanks, king, we'll take it. Don't let the settlers encroach on our land. And the founders were like, no, 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 no. We really, really want to encroach on that land. Can we please start encroaching now? And many went to war because for a variety of reasons, including they wanted this land. And certain people, like Daniel Boone and Joseph Martin, decided to encroach anyway. That made a lot of Native Americans want to side with the British in the war, and Joseph Martin played a very important role keeping certain parts of the Native Americans, certain parts of the Cherokee Nation from taking any side. And it was honestly better. It would have been near impossible to get them to fight for the Americans, but it took a lot of hard work to get them to fight for no one. And because of that, things like the Battle of Kings Mountain and several other battles in the South were won because the Native Americans didn't help the British. They didn't do anything, and that was sweet. I also found it interesting about Joseph Martin Jr. He was a member of 3 assemblies during the founding. He was from Virginia. Over the course of the Revolution and the American founding in general, he was so he actually spent time in 3 different revolutionary and state governments, early state governments. Not during the war. Can't call the government revolutionary. They were states at that point. You get my drift. And finally, it's really interesting that Martin he had done a real lot of work with the Cherokee, and he expected to be named as Superintendent of Indian Affairs when the Constitution was established and George Washington took over as president. He really expected to have this position, and by all accounts, he had the best resume for it. But some people thought he was a little too friendly with the Native Americans, which was true. He did look out for them and try and get them the most fair deal, not get them the best deal. He tried to get everyone the fairest deal for everyone. And certain people said, no, we want the fairest deal for Americans. And we don't care about the deal they get. And because he was viewed as a little bit too friendly, he was not given the position of Superintendent of Indian Affairs, which made him upset. He basically went home after that, but Virginia did name him a brigadier general in the state militia, so he held that honorary title, and he is now currently referred to as General Joseph Martin because of that. Did see some comments coming in. What are we talking about? Did I have more problems? My bit rate's low again. I don't know what that means. Were the Cherokees in Virginia? We have several local tribes such as the Powhatan, but I didn't know Cherokees were here. I did some reading on Indian agents after I read the article about Martin. The Indian agent history is extraordinarily interesting. And you definitely want to keep in mind, as I said earlier, Native Americans were very different from one another. And especially at a time where even like the Cherokee split in half about this time. Because, some of the younger ones wanted to fight the settlers, some of the older ones wanted to be friendly. And they were all over the place. So there were several Indian agents doing different things. You have one of the Butler brothers in New York, another Butler, I think unrelated, working with Martin, who I think was a Butler he became Superintendent of Indian Affairs at that time. You have William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. No, first it was Meriwether Lewis, then William Clark, who was governor of the Louisiana Territory and then the Missouri Territory because it changed names because it was starting to split up. They were dealing with several Native Americans over there. You have the Seminole in Florida. So it is very interesting and fairly complicated. I recommend looking at it one tribe at a time, one nation at a time, and the Indian agent from there on out, instead of finding an Indian agent and try and look at the Native American tribes he worked with. But go about it however you wish. It's a lot of fun. Were there Americans didn't look at borders the same way we did? Granted, First of all, it depends what Virginia. Modern Virginia, probably not. But when West Virginia was part of Virginia, and when Kentucky was part of Virginia, and even like Tennessee was Tennessee Virginia? No, it was North Carolina, but like part of it, Virginia thought was Virginia. So a little bit. It seems like kind of at the time they overlapped slightly. It seems to have been mostly North Carolina and like what we would consider South Carolina and Georgia today, but mostly kind of not. You could see why Virginia. I don't think they overlapped at all because most of Virginia today is on this side of the east side of the Appalachians. But back then, when Virginia went indefinitely into the Pacific Ocean, a little bit. Although they would have been in the southern part of that area. So, good question. That's a great question. You can tell they're good questions when I stumble over my words and have trouble answering. Yes, Virginia was geographically huge. Humongous. So was Connecticut, actually. Connecticut officially went to the Pacific Ocean. Most states went to the Pacific Ocean when they first got here. But nothing was bigger than Virginia. Virginia, essentially, included most of Ohio, modern West Virginia, most of Kentucky, part of Tennessee, part of Indiana. A huge swath of everything from Pennsylvania and North Carolina to the Mississippi. Actually, one of the reasons it took so long for the Articles of Confederation to first be brought into service was Maryland held out for several years until Virginia ceded its land in the West to the federal government. After they... it was expected, and once the Americans would win the war, we would get the Northwest Territory. And that would all end up being free, and that would be government-owned. And the idea was, since this is coming, we should really set a precedent by giving some land to the federal government out in that direction, as well as, and more importantly, we can't have Virginia be that big. They're already most unpopulated, and they were the wealthiest. We can't let them have this land, or they're just going to conquer all of us. It's inevitable. It's only a matter of time. And keep in mind, Virginia would eventually cede that land, as would Connecticut, and then Maryland would ratify. But remember, like, this is... Virginia still included West Virginia for another 80 years until the Civil War. So it remained very, very large. Let's see, okay. I keep getting this thing telling me I'm having service trouble. I apologize if there's any problems. But I'm going to keep going. Let's just more questions. Because we're over an hour. This is officially the longest video we've ever made. But it's because you're asking questions, and that's really what I wanted to make this about. Oh. I finished my coffee. Let's talk about the Supreme Court. Federalist number 80. Federalist number 80 by Alexander Hamilton. We're closing in on the end of the Federalist Papers. He discussed essentially what the Supreme Court was allowed to do, and defended why it was there to do it. I basically kind of went through it like a list. This is one of the many Federalist Papers that gets extraordinarily wordy, and again, what I try and do every week is just sum it up for you so you can understand it without having to deal with it. He essentially says that the government does the courts do 5 things, and more or less it's for 2 reasons. They are supposed to rule in cases regarding federal laws, regarding the Constitution, regarding when the government is a party, either the defendant or the prosecutor, anything that regards the peace of the Confederacy, and anything dealing with maritime law. Those 5 things. So we'll go through it real quick. As for federal laws, he said, it's the federal government. We can't have the state governments ruling on cases about federal law. That just doesn't make any sense. If it's a discussion about a federal law, it needs to be the federal government, if not a higher court. But since there is no higher court, the highest government needs to be ruled on by the highest court. Or else it would... Regarding the Constitution. If we have a court case regarding the federal Constitution, you can't have states ruling on that. You need to have the federal government ruling on this. And he does point out that, you know, we have the checks and balances. The Supreme Court is here. You know, it's dangerous to have someone ruling on the government. It's dangerous to have the federal government make rulings on itself. But this is why we have these checks and balances, to make sure they can't abuse this. But if you got a case about federal laws or the United States Constitution, you need to have the federal government make these rulings. He goes on to say, if the government is a defendant in a case, you need to have the federal government. You can't have the state ruling against the federal government. Come on. That's Hamilton saying, come on, not me. And I'm paraphrasing. It's not exactly how he puts it. And then he gets into things, the Peace of the Confederacy and maritime law, both of which involve foreign entities to some degree. And you can't have a state rule against a foreign government or a foreign person because it might draw us into war. And like he says, it's not fair to have part of the country drag the entire thing into war. You know, you can't have, I don't know, all the other states just because New Hampshire's crying about something. Sorry, New Hampshire. I don't know why I picked New Hampshire as an example. But if there is a problem and the entire federal government with all the states' powers behind it rules against Great Britain, well, we might go to war, but at least we have representatives from each state. It's all behind, which is... And actually, John Jay had discussed earlier. Definitely, Madison said it at one point too. You can't have part of the country bringing the rest of it to war, and that's why if we're going to have an alliance, we need to have an overall alliance between, you know, we need a federal government bringing us to war instead of just an association which says we'll probably help each other out. Breaking up a bit here. I'm sorry, Ned. I am sorry. Well, we're going to wrap it up here. If you had any more questions, if you missed anything, if it broke up, I apologize. Don't know why. I just got my... Ugh, lame. I'm sorry. I just got a new wire run to my house. It should... Well, go for an hour. Contacted them. I'm not receiving enough video to me. Tell you what, I'm going to leave a message in the comments. Okay, thanks guys. TJ, Eastern time. Eastern time. Able to connect to chat. I appreciate you guys coming, and I will see you on Wednesday at 7 Eastern time. Bye now.